I really appreciate that enthusiasm as we begin to enter the later hours of the evening. So, Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to stand on this bill because I think that it's an example of a trend in this government, and I'll explain myself throughout my speech. But really, I'm concerned at the way in which we go about making laws in this country, and I think that this is an excellent example of how the Conservative government's leadership on drafting legislation, bringing it through the House, and how it acts in the public really flies in the face of a Canada that I grew up in and that I was proud to say I was a part of. Now I have to say that when I stand in this House, I feel very, very sad for our legislative process. To begin, I want to talk a little bit about what this bill is really about. It's not really about whatever it's called, keeping respect for communities. Similar, again, a trend in some of the bills that we see, safe communities, etc. When really this is not at all about communities. It's about marginalizing those who are already marginalizing, putting further violence in the lives of those who already have to live with so much violence, and putting in danger those who are already in danger. So essentially, this is about insight. This entire bill is about insight. What insight is, for those who may not be familiar, is essentially it's a Vancouver area place where those who are unable to access, those who are addicted to drugs, essentially, are able to go for safe injection, because we all understand what addiction is, at least on this side of the House, and that there are ways of making addiction and coming out of addiction, making it safer for these individuals so that they may escape the cycle of drug abuse, or at least, if they cannot, because we know that can be the case, at least that they not be put in positions where they are more vulnerable. So following an increase of overdose deaths in Vancouver between 87 and 93, the Vancouver Coastal Health Authority and community partners actually set up Insight, and since then there was a huge decrease in diseases such as Hep A, B, C, and HIV/AIDS. Now, originally this Insight, this location was, and this program was exempted under the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act. And what has caused us to be in the situation now is that in 2008, Insight, under the 56 exemption from the Drugs and Substances Act, expired in 2008, and the Minister of Health denied its renewal. Now, this meant that there were subsequent court cases, and it was brought up to the Supreme Court of Canada. And it's in 2011 that the Supreme Court ruled that the minister's decision to close Insight, to not renew the exemption under the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act, was a violation of charter rights of those who were part of the program, and that the minister's decision was, quote, arbitrary, undermining the very purposes of the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act, which includes public health and safety. So that's sort of an overview of why we're here. Why we're here now is because the Conservatives are not in agreement ideologically with the Supreme Court's ruling. We're now seeing this bill come in that impose extremely stringent conditions on Insight, on places like Insight, and will really dissuade any other communities that have the need from participating in such type programs. So this, Mr. Speaker, is not, in a sense, this bill is only about Insight, and in the sense this bill is so exemplary of a trend in the Conservative government. They have such profound disrespect for any Supreme Court ruling that comes forward that goes against their ideology. They have a complete disrespect of the judicial branch in this country, of the process, of the fact that when a decision is made by the Supreme Court, if they don't like it, then too bad, because they are not the defenders of rights and freedoms in this country. The courts are, and that's why we have a separate judicial process. And unfortunately, the Conservatives keep finding ways of going around any of those decisions that are made by bringing forward legislation that flies in the face of it, sort of, goes around it so that they can fit their ideology. So, for instance, the court, in this case, based its decision on the Section 7 of the Charter. Everyone has the right to life, liberty, and security of a person, and the right not to be deprived thereof, except in accordance with the principles of fundamental justice. Now, this is extremely, extremely common, that what we're actually seeing the Conservatives disagree with fundamentally, ideologically, in Supreme Court rulings is things that have to do with people's security, people's health, people's right to be able to life and to security. And that's what's so extremely scary about this trend, Mr. Speaker, because the Supreme Court did rule that Insight and other supervised injection sites must be granted a Section 56 exemption when they decrease the risk to death and disease, and there is little or no evidence that they have a negative impact on the community. And because Insight does not have a negative impact on the community, quite the opposite, has a very positive impact on the community, they now have to go through this bill to try and create stringent conditions for Insight. Now, this is blatant disrespect and disregard for the Insight ruling. It completely flies in the face of it. And this is in a context of a government that has challenged the Supreme Court over and over again through these backwards ways of coming into the House and bringing in legislation that flies in the face of a ruling. I think of, for instance, we're thinking of particularly, this is a very, very close case, in my opinion, this is the exact same type of situation. Bill C-36 that was recently put down really flies in the face of the Bedford decision that was very clear that given the dangerous conditions of sex work, those who are engaged in it need to be able to take the steps to protect themselves. But now we have a bill that's honestly so disempowering. It's just not an exaggeration to say that lives are going to be put at risk due to this legislation. We also have C-42, which is the immigration bill that creates dual citizenships, as dual citizens, people who are treated as second-class citizens who potentially will be deported and put in danger in countries that they may never have even known. Mr. Speaker. And in the context of this is also in the context of several crime bills that have been returned due to unconstitutionality. And so we see over and over that the Conservatives are marginalizing at-risk Canadians and further marginalizing already marginalized groups. Now, there are many justice bills, as I mentioned, follow the same model. They ostracize, isolate, and divide people instead of trying to address the root issue. The Conservatives tackle symptoms without even looking for the source of the problem, and they throw people in jail without helping them reintegrate into society, and that does not solve the problem, Mr. Speaker. And let's not forget the unelected and unaccountable Senate blocking my colleague's bill that on gender identity, creating rights for trans Canadians who are so marginalized and put in situations of violence. Now, I don't think I have time to get into the difference between an unelected, unaccountable Senate going against the elected thoughts of the House, and the difference between the judicial process, which is to protect the rights of Canadians despite the democratic things that happen in this House. So those two things work together, whereas the Senate works against that process. But over and over, the government's choosing ideology over facts. And in these cases, every time the government is going to outrageous lengths really to subvert the courts. And these bills, Mr. Speaker, I am not exaggerating. I know I'm out of time, but I really want to get this out. These bills are putting people in danger.
Sorry. Before we go to questions and comments, I see the Honourable Government House Leader may be rising on a point.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I would like to advise that agreements could not be reached under the provisions of Standing Order 78.1 and 78.2 with respect to the second reading stages of Bill C-12, an act to respect the Corrections and Conditional Release Act, and C-35, an act to amend the Criminal Code, law enforcement animals, military animals, and service animals. Under the provisions of Standing Order 78.3, I give notice that a Minister of the Crown will propose at the next sitting motions to allot a specific number of days or hours for the consideration and disposal of proceedings at the said stages of the said bills. It's all.
I'm sure the House appreciates the notice from the Honourable Government House Leader. Now we're going to questions and comments. Questions et commentaires. The Honourable Member for Okanagan, Coquihalla.
Here, here.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I just want to thank the member opposite for her speech. Certainly glad we're debating issues. I think that people would be happy to see that we're seized with such ones. My question is very simple. There are many things that are under federal regulations, Mr. Speaker. One, for example, is cell towers. We now require consultation with communities to make sure that if a cell tower goes in, that the community is apprised and that consultation is made properly. Now, does the member not agree that having a insight-like location should also merit public consultation, the same as we do right now with cell towers? Is there not a need to be able to consult with people about that issue?
Good question.
Deputy Argento Papineau-Mirabel.
Now, I'm not from British Columbia, so I won't engage in that, but I do want to point out that there has been, over and over again, this government not consulting the constituencies that they should be consulting when they've got bills that are significantly affecting these communities. And I'm going to bring up UNDRIP. To be specific, we're signed on to the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and that, Mr. Speaker, calls that we meaningfully consult with First Nations communities with anything that has to do with their territory and their sovereignty and their rights to their language, culture, etc. And yet, every single time we have seen a bill come forward amending the Indian Act or affecting these communities in some other way, we have seen the Conservative government go to extreme lengths to avoid any kind of meaningful consultation other than maybe, we got one email saying that they support us, and that's not, and over again we see this, and it's sincerely, truly sad to see that member stand up on cell towers, which, is an issue that is important to my constituents as well, but it's just such hypocrisy, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Bonavista, Gander, Grand Falls, Windsor.
Mr. Speaker, has been said here tonight by many people, and we talk about a potential of a charter challenge once more, stemming from this type of legislation. It seems to run against logic in this particular case. It's not like this is something that you can't see coming in a challenge, and you try to look at your legislation that protects the fundamental rights contained within our charter. In this case, it's Section 7 and the exemption which is laid out, of course, in Section 56 and the continuation of it. My question to my colleague is very simply, with the rules that are now in place following the recent Supreme Court decision, does she feel that the rules and guidelines set down, as which the government brags about, are particularly onerous in that it's setting a bar that is too high to reach for any potential injection site that in the future in this country? Thank you.
Honourable Member for Argenteuil Papineau-Mirabel.
Mr. Speaker, this bill really does put way too much onus on the communities to prove that the benefits of these sites, when the court ruling was very clear that the onus is actually on the government to prove that these are dangerous to the community. But unfortunately for their ideological way of seeing the world, the number of overdose deaths has dropped by 35% in Vancouver since Insite opened. And that's such a significant statistic, Mr. Speaker. It goes against the ideology of the government, so they're going to go to great lengths just to subvert the courts on this, clearly.
Well, we have time for one more short question. Question et commentaire. La députée de Saint-Bruno, Saint-Hubert.
Monsieur le Président, j'ai écouté avec attention le discours de ma collègue et je l'ai trouvé très éloquent et pertinent. Nous savons que les utilisateurs de drogues injectables qui utilisent Insight sont 70 moins susceptibles de partager les seringues. Et la réduction de l'échange de seringues a été répertoriée comme une pratique exemplaire à l'échelle internationale pour réduire le VIH, le sida et l'hépatite B et l'hépatite C. Sauf que là, depuis le début du débat sur ce projet de loi, nous avons remarqué que nos collègues au niveau du gouvernement ne cessent d'adopter la politique de l'autruche, c'est-à-dire ils penchent leur tête dans les sables bitumineux au lieu de regarder la santé et sécurité des Canadiens et Canadiennes. Ne pensent-ils pas qu'ils devraient être plus réalistes et descendre sur terrain?
La députée d'Argenteuil-Papineau-Mirabel, une brève réponse.
Of course, we're talking about a government that's trying to appoint judges who aren't qualified to the Supreme Court, of course. I forgot to mention that throughout my speech. But effectivement, it's proven that Insight has brought down, the risk of contracting and spreading bloodborne diseases like HIV/AIDS, like Hep C, and so but these are all facts, and it doesn't seem like the Conservatives care about facts. It doesn't mean anything for them because they're not governing for every Canadian. They're governing by ideology, and they're trying to score political points. And while they're doing that, they're putting lives in danger, Mr. Speaker. It's putting people's lives in danger, and that's why I cannot support this bill.